Good morning. Okay, so who has heard of this first story in Genesis that we read today about the garden and the fruit? Yeah, we're all a little bit familiar with this maybe? Yep. All right, so we know it goes something like this, right? God creates man and woman, and he sets them in this gorgeous garden paradise and says, look, this is all for you. Have fun. Do whatever you want. But don't eat from this one tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right? And we talk sometimes in Bible study about well, what kind of tree do you think it was? Was it maybe peaches? What do you think? Was it figs? It was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right? It's the one we're not supposed to eat from. So then God goes away, and Adam and Eve are hanging out. And one day they decide maybe it'd be a good idea to, eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And so they do that. And then there's this, we pick up the story here, right, today. And there's a rustling of leaves, right? And Adam and Eve are like, oh, it's God. Hide. We're totally busted, right? And God comes and he says, well, hello, Adam. And Adam's like, hi, God. And God's like, what'd you do? And Adam's like, I didn't do it. It's not my fault, right? Isn't that our first reaction when we're totally busted? It's not my fault. It's not my fault. She did it. The woman you gave me, she gave me the fruit and I ate it. It's not my fault. She did it, right? And so God's like, all right, Eve, what'd you do? And Eve's like, I didn't do it. It's not my fault, man. I didn't do it. It was the serpent. Yeah, the serpent. The serpent tricked me and I ate the fruit. Or I gave the fruit to Adam and Adam ate the fruit. And and we were all tricked by the serpent. It's not my fault, right? It was like, that's the first thing we do when we're busted. Not my fault. It's not my fault. I didn't do it. We went yesterday to the farmer's market in Prior Lake with my family, and I was so excited about it that my kids asked to go to the farmer's market, and I was like, really? I would love to go to the farmer's market with you. I'd love nothing more than we'll get donuts. It's going to be a perfect day. I can't wait, right? So we headed off for our perfect day at the farmer's market. We were going to stop for donuts at Edelweiss first, and we stopped and we waited in the line, and it was no problem. We'll get through this line, no problem, and everybody's doing great. And I went and I ordered 2 identical donuts. They were identical donuts, okay? Chocolate on the top with sprinkles. I briefly considered counting the sprinkles and making sure that they were even, but I'm like, I'm not going to be that mom, right? Y'all, I should have been that mom, right? Because I put the donuts down in front of my kids. I've got a 3-year-old and an 8-year-old. Put the donuts in front of my kids, and the big one says, no fair. His donut is bigger than mine. At which point, craziness ensued, right? And everybody's, I want the bigger donut. I want the bigger donut. Guys, the donuts are exactly the same. We're going to be the calm, controlled, rational family having a wonderful day at the farmer's market, right? Okay, donuts are exactly the same, guys. So the 3-year-old decides to be the bigger man and push his donut over to the 8-year-old and says, here, right? At which point the 8-year-old eats the donut and the 3-year-old says, wait, I want that donut back. Okay? Which is not possible unless, of course, it's not possible. So this is the point at which I said, all right, guys, just eat your donuts, right? Can you just be grateful that you have donuts and blah, 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 right, whatever? But it's all about, he started it. It's his fault. He started it. No, he started it. He's the one who ate my donut. Well, you gave me my donut. Well, you said mine was bigger. And I said, all right, guys. And then I walked outside and I went, it's not my fault. It's not my fault. He started it, Isn't that how it always is, right? He started it. It's not my fault. So we hear in Mark's gospel here, If a kingdom is divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. And if a house is divided against itself, that house will not be able to stand. Right? If we're divided against ourselves, we're not able to stand. And that standing together begins with us being able to admit to our part in whatever is going on. And I was thinking about that yesterday, and I really wanted to admit to my part in it, which was that I had unrealistic expectations, right? Totally unrealistic expectations. I thought for sure we were going to be that family in linen capris who was at the farmer's market having a perfect day together with no incidents around bees being around anybody or anybody getting more popcorn than anybody else, right? My expectations were unrealistic. But in the moment, it wasn't my fault, right? It's so hard to remember that we have a part in whatever situation is going on. It's really a hard thing to do because so often when we hear that first rustling of leaves, that first moment when we know we're busted, right? It's so hard to remember grace. It seems so much easier to say, I didn't do it. This is why. This is the reason. It's not my fault, right? It's not my fault. It seems so much easier to construct this reason why we should be let off the hook for anything. It seems like it's a lot easier, but God knows that it's not. So, we hear in our second reading here, everything is for your sake, so that grace, as it extends to more and more people, may increase thanksgiving to the glory of God. And this grace, this is this word of grace that we hear here and that we can carry out into the world with us. And the beauty of grace, the beauty of forgiveness, is that it's limitless. There is no end to forgiveness. There is no point at which God says, all right, that's it, you're out, right? So it's a little bit troubling when we read in Mark's gospel here, and it would be really a lot easier for me if they could just cut these verses out of the Bible, but they didn't. I called and they're like, nope, sorry, got to leave those in. Whoever put the Bible together. But verses 28 and 29 of Mark's gospel here that we're looking at, chapter 3, it says, truly I tell you, people will be forgiven for their sins and whatever blasphemies they utter. But whoever blasphemes against the Holy Spirit can never have forgiveness, but is guilty of an eternal sin. So there have been a lot of folks who have grown up understanding these verses, and a lot of churches who have taught, understanding these verses to mean like, you better watch out what you say, right? Because there's going to be this one thing that's going to get you. Like, if you do X, Y, or Z, or if you say X, Y, or Z, you know which section you're sitting in the afterlife, right? And it's not the good one, right? So there have been churches who have taught this and folks who have grown up with this utter fear. What I understand these verses to mean is that there is such a loneliness and so much pain that comes from being alone in our guilt, being alone and feeling just this feeling that we get, and blaming this on God and saying, God, it's your fault, and cutting ourselves off from God. It's okay to be mad at God, but the forgiveness piece, or the piece of the forgiveness, comes when we can say, God, I need help, right? God, I need help. Because there is nothing not a single thing that God can't be with us in. So I was talking with somebody yesterday about a personal tragedy. And they said, well, everything happens for a reason, right? And I can't stand up here and say that God creates tragedy in order for people to learn stuff. I can stand up here and say, with every fiber of my being, that because we are broken people and we live in a broken world, stuff happens. Tragedy happens. And God enters into that and is with us in that and will never, ever stop working with us to make whatever that is into something that is life-giving. Here's another really familiar story to folks who have been hanging around the church for a little while. It's one of the cross and the empty tomb. Have you guys heard that one too? It's our central story, right? That God in the flesh was hanging on the cross. And God entered into this and said, this I can work with. This I can do something with. We can use this tragedy to show people the depth of God's love and the extent of God's love and forgiveness, the absolute worst thing that people could ever have done, God turned into a vehicle for forgiveness and grace and love and new life. And it was the empty tomb. And it was God saying, there's nothing that you can do that will get me to dump you. And there's nothing that you can do that can't be forgiven by God. God knows that we need each other. God knows that we need to be together in community, in families, in communities, in congregations, with our co-workers, and that one divided against another, it will not stand. And so, when we hear the rustling of the leaves, right, we're like, I'm busted. God comes into the garden and says, what are you doing, Adam? Right? What are you doing, Laila? What'd you do? May we all have the grace to take a deep breath and say, I ate the fruit, and experience God's unconditional love and forgiveness as God wraps God's arms around us and says, I know, and I forgive you, and I love you, and I will never, ever leave you. Now, let's make something out of this together. Thanks be to God. Amen.